and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Hoover, for not just this event, but this book really is a joint venture by the Hoover Institution and the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, with a couple of outside partners as well. And so this is a very appropriate place for a discussion of the book. I think by now everybody's picked up their copy of the book. I assume the quick readers in the room have now read it. For those who might not have, I am going to do a very quick tour via the handout that looks like this. So follow along with me, and then we will get to this terrific panel, all of whose biographies are in a different handout, and therefore I'm not going to do any long introductions when we get to that point, because you can read about them, and I don't want to waste their time. Brandon, my co-author, and I have pointed out some obvious but important things, and if there's really a central purpose to the book, it's to get the country to awaken to the fact that we're not doing well by our high ability students, and we're doing especially poorly by our high ability poor students, disadvantaged students. And if there is a mission to the book, it is to get this issue, this problem, this set of problems on the agenda for more attention than it's been getting lately. The evidence begins on page 2. The slides are numbered in the upper right-hand corner. This is 2013 NAEP data. The 2015 NAEP data will be out the day after tomorrow. A few people, like Commissioner Smith here, have already seen it, but it's embargoed and I haven't seen it. So I can't tell you, truly can't tell you, because I don't know. But look at the 2013 data. I'll be surprised if it's much better. It may be worse. And these are the percentages of kids who get to the advanced level in math and reading. And as you probably know, NAEP is scored basic, proficient, and advanced. Advanced is meant to be world class, and we don't get a whole lot of kids there. We get more kids there in the earlier grades than we do in the later grades. 4th grade's not as bad. 12th grade really sucks, but the whole thing is not very pretty. Page 3, begin the international comparison. On PISA, 27 of 34 OECD countries get more students into the high ranks on PISA, levels 5 and 6 on the 6-part PISA scoring scale. In science, 20 countries; in reading, 18 countries. If you look at TIMSS, it's not quite as bleak, but it's pretty bad. Half the OECD countries that take TIMSS produce more high scorers in 8th grade math. 6 do it in 8th grade science. Next page. This is up the vertical axis is the average score. These are now the countries in our study. We picked them because they were high scorers, so that's not a surprise. Hungary turned out to not be a high scorer. We were wrong about Hungary. But the others we picked because they are high scorers. But here is how big the differences are. Up the vertical axis is their average PISA score in math. And across the horizontal axis is the percentage of their students who make it to levels 5 and 6. And look who, along with Hungary, is in the lower left on this, on both metrics. We're mostly concerned here about high scorers, but as you can see, you've previously heard about the problem with the average PISA score. Everybody knows that. This is the high scoring percentages as well. Now turn to page 5, and we split the population of test takers within the U.S. into poor and non-poor kids. And some people, like Harold Levy here, think this is actually the most telling graph in the book. You'll find it back in the appendix in the book itself. This has got a lot of data in it. This is just U.S., this is just NAEP, this is just 8th grade, this is just math. So be clear on that. It gives you parents' education level and race and poverty. Eligible for free and reduced price lunch means poor. Over to the right means not poor, at least not eligible for the subsidized lunch program. Look for any big numbers, and first of all, most of them are Asian. There are more in the right-hand column, the non-poor, than there are in the left-hand column. And if you focus in particular on Hispanic and Black, you're not going to see any big numbers. And even if you look at Hispanic and Black with relatively well-educated parents, these are not big numbers. And if you look at Hispanic and Black and poor, you find essentially 3% and 1% at that upper end. In the same column where 15% of Asian kids, these are with college graduate parents, are in the high-scoring ranks. So this begins to illustrate the gap, and so does the next page. This is now international gap. What we did on page 6 with these data, and Brandon did all the heavy lifting on the data, so when we get into the discussion, if you've got serious technical data questions, they're for him. They're most definitely not for me. But the vertical axis is the percent of kids in the top quartile of SES in these countries that make it into the high-scoring ranks. And on the horizontal axis, with a much more spread out scale, is the percentage of kids from the bottom quartile of the SES ranks who make it into the top scorers, again, PISA math. But you find much the same thing with science and reading. Save the questions. We will get back to this, and you will have an opportunity. And I'm not the techie. So look who's in the bottom left here, both with the smallest percentage of relatively prosperous kids in the top scoring rank, and very definitely the lowest percentage, other than Hungary, of kids in the low-income quartile making it into the ranks of high scorers. Now, as Harold said in a session earlier today that we were at with him, you can sort of explain away Taiwan and Singapore and Korea being in the upper right, because everybody knows about them. But how do you explain Switzerland and Germany and Canada and Finland being as far up that line as they are, and how far down we are? Okay, I'm nearly done. How do the other countries do better? Just a few examples. In Japan, there are lots of selective admission high schools with exam-based admission. In Singapore, they screen everybody in 3rd grade, and the top scorers get into special gifted programs full-time, starting in 4th grade, regardless of their SES status. In Western Australia, they screen everybody in 4th grade. Their programs in the middle school are not so great, but in the high school, they've got gifted sections in a dozen of their high schools, and 2 high schools that are only for high achievers. Germany, some of the high schools, the gymnasia, have special sections for high ability or high scoring students. Ontario throws a bit of a curveball and classifies giftedness as part of special ed, with the mixed blessing that comes with being part of special ed. On the one hand, some attention and resources and priority, and on the other hand, a whole lot of red tape and complexity and endless recalibrating. What should the United States do? The last chapter of the book. You can read it we have 10 recommendations, really very quickly. I already said, get the topic on our agenda. Stronger data, better research. When NCLB, when and if it ever gets reauthorized, judge schools for gains by students across the spectrum, not just those beneath the bar we call proficient. Right now, schools mostly get credit just for getting kids up to that line, not for getting kids who are already over the line any farther up. A few harder things to do, but we could do them. Universal screening, we're already testing everybody starting in 3rd grade in math and reading. So who are the high scorers in every school? Not across the state, then you know who'd end up being the top 5%. But what about the top scoring 5% or 8% or 10% in every school, every neighborhood? What about, now this will really throw a curveball at somebody that actually has to run a school or a system. How about letting kids progress through school based on mastery at their own speed, rather than assuming that everybody who's 11 belongs in something called 5th grade, taking something called 5th grade courses, being held to the same standard, judged by the same test? What if they move at their own speed? Flexible ability grouping, not rigid tracking. Multi-age and multi-grade groupings, take use of technology for blended learning opportunities, supplemental outside school, and finally, start young, don't wait for high school and advanced placement courses. A big opportunity here for philanthropy as well as government, and needless to say, every school needs at least some staff members who know how to do this. That is it for the book, though we go into considerably greater length in the book, and we hope you will not only take a copy, but actually read it. And if you like it, tell Amazon. and enjoy. So it's a pleasure to introduce Jack Smith, the acting superintendent of the state of Maryland. I've got the good fortune for the last few months to be on the Maryland State Board, so we have a multiple relationship here. And he is especially good to come in a week when they are releasing park data and NAEP data. And he's going to have his phone ring probably already on both. Harold Levy, who ran the New York City schools with considerable success, now runs the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, has become a real ally in our effort to get this topic on the agenda. Brother Brian Carty, whom I know the least well, but who runs a couple of private schools in New York City that do wonders with high ability poor kids. So in a real actual school, and my colleague Brandon Wright from the Fordham Institute, and co-author of the book. So this is terrific opportunity. I want to go to Harold first because just a few months before our book came out, the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation came out with I think a very important report on state policy as regards gifted education. And I think it's kind of gloomy findings, but why don't you tell us what you found?
So first of all, thank you for organizing this, and thank you for having this terrific panel. The Jack Kent Cooke Foundation gives out scholarships to exceptionally high-performing low-income students. We do it in the 7th grade, the 12th grade, and to transfer students from community college. As part of a thought leadership exercise, we commissioned a study of 50 states on a 9-point program of rough cut what Checker's recommending in the back here. And are the states doing it? And the other side of it was, and how successful are they being? Every state got crummy grades, and that's because no state was doing it well, present company accepted. The problem here is that, as Checker suggests, the states have so intensively gone after proficiency that they've taken their eye off the ball of what to do with high-performing, low-income kids. And part of that problem is the language that we use. These aren't, quote, gifted kids, although they are gifted, but gifted is a status.
Press the button on the
No,
top.
I did press the button. I did as instructed.
Okay. He doesn't often.
Yeah. What can I say? So what we found was that very few states had comprehensive policies. They didn't accelerate kids, they didn't identify them, and they didn't give them a pathway. With the consequence that, lo and behold, the kids weren't doing all that well. That if you were a high-performing kid but came from a low-income background, the likelihood was the longer you stayed in public education, the worse you do. And the study showed that, in fact, the policies were not in place, and the results were very disappointing. The kids all across the country were being ignored, and even where they were recognized, even where there were policies in place, they weren't comprehensive, and so they weren't very effective. And in a nutshell, Checker's book and Brendan's book nails it. It's a problem, and it's a problem in every state in the union.
As I recollect, the B- was about the highest grade you gave any states on
That's
their
right.
policies. Is that right?
That's right.
And the
Wasn't
report.
Maryland.
Say
Wasn't
again?
Maryland.
It wasn't
Wasn't
Maryland. I'm remembering Minnesota and someplace else got a B-. But the report is on the
Texas.
Foundation's website, and including a report card on each state. So you can actually dig in and see how any state that interests you does according to the criteria that they used on this study. I think it's very important because most of the action on this, I mean, there's a little tiny federal program called the Javits Scholarship Program, but the real action on this is at the state and local level, which of course takes us to Jack Smith. How is Maryland handling the education of high ability students?
Well, according to the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, we're a C+. And I thought that was rather generous, which may not be the politically correct answer. But just as you indicate in your book about some of the countries, I think Maryland's marginally higher grade is due to other circumstances rather than focusing on the needs of high achieving or high ability students. And that is that we only have 24 school systems. And 24 school systems can be a significant disadvantage, but in some ways it's an advantage because one, you have economy of scale. So the smallest school system has 2,000 students in it. That's twice as large as over 10,000 of the school systems in this country. And so of the 14,000 school systems, 10,000 or so have fewer than 1,000 or fewer students. Maryland has the advantage of having 2,000 to 160,000 students in its schools. The other issue is you have 3.1 million teachers in this country, about 60,000 in Maryland, and as you identify in the book, neither the teacher preparation programs prepare teachers, including me as a teacher in beginning 1980, to meet the needs of these students, nor are we particularly adept at working with teachers who are in the classroom now in professional development programs. It just has not been an area of focus probably since the 1980s.
So get to why. Why is it not focused on in Maryland or any place else you want to talk about?
Well, I think that you illustrate it very clearly in the book. We have a very egalitarian nature in this country, so immediately people are kind of drawn to the idea that you meet the needs of the average kid or the underdog, and it's expensive, and there is the false belief that students who have higher abilities or higher cognitive capacity don't need that, which is in effect saying they don't need a teacher and that school has no impact for them. That's what it says when we say those sorts of things. And so in Maryland, as we worked from 2003 to the current No Child Left Behind year we're in right now with the waivers, it was all about proficiency. And if we only take kids to proficiency, they are not prepared to do anything in this country for their own success, whether it's higher education, whether it's a living wage job. They're prepared to fry French fries and enroll in developmental classes at the community college. Only 28% of whom will actually go on and complete that AA out of all the kids who go to developmental. There's just no focus. And so, for example, if we did just what Dr. Finn said and said that in our accountability systems, schools are expected and encouraged and rewarded both to move students to proficiency and to move them to a higher level, then that would be a huge benefit. That has not happened yet. So there are a lot of reasons, and they are pretty clearly outlined in your book. And then how you implement this in 100,000 schools. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It means we have to think carefully about how to move it forward.
Come back to Maryland in a minute, because there's lots of questions about what states do and don't do and what's possible and what's not possible. Brother Brian, I talk about your schools. You are doing this in the private sector for the very kids we're talking about in the book. You're doing it, I believe, with private dollars, and you're doing it very well. How does it work? What are you doing? Where do you find these kids? How do you educate them?
Well, I like to describe it as we're a charity that runs a school. We actually run two schools,
Yep.
having to raise the money from outside sources. Much of it from the philanthropic community. Started out with the philanthropic community being very, very strong supporters, and now the individual philanthropic community from individuals. Actually, both schools got started with the help of a bunch of former students of mine from a school that we ran back in the 1960s. Some of them are here in this room, Mike Frank being one of them, who helped me actually get De La Salle started.
You're responsible for him?
I think he's responsible for me. Because I think the key is that after this, the Kelly School closed. I kept Monsignor Kelly School.
An archdiocesan school in New York City.
That was 65 to 72. It was a wonderful, wonderful experiment geared for boys. And it was to deal with the bright boys in regular classrooms were being underserved, particularly in the Black and Hispanic community. Many of them were not following through in the high schools. And also de facto segregation was a fact of life. So it was taking the school, starting in 6th grade, middle school, 1/3 Black, 1/3 Hispanic, 1/3 white and Asian. And get them when they're still open to each other. So bonds of friendship began to really open the doors, and there were other possibilities. There's another world out there. Actually, got them out of the neighborhood into Manhattan, which was a wonderful thing in and of itself. Okay, Diano, as they say. So
That's a term of art.
I don't know. It's a wonderful term. I love it. Okay, hey, the school closed in '72, but I kept in touch with the Kelly alums, and I said, look, this made such an impact on us. Let's do it again. So I went out to them and I said, okay, guys, tell me what worked, what didn't work. If we're going to start it, what do we need? So basically, most of the curriculum that we have at De La Salle, the fact that it's a needs-blind admission, it's a preferential option for the poorer child, and we would raise the money somehow. And it really was somehow, we did raise it. And so we're now going on 30 years. The issue that we started a second school because we started to notice the drop-off of boys to girls applying. Significant drop-off, to the point that my application pool was maybe 70, 75% girls, 25, 30% boys. And you go out and you talk to the schools that were feeder schools, say, okay, guys, tell me what's going on. And they say, we're losing them. We're losing them in third grade, losing them in fourth grade. Okay, by losing them meant to say that academic piece was no longer of interest to them.
De La Salle starts in sixth, am I right?
De La Salle starts in sixth.
Okay.
But George Jackson, the other school that we started in grade 4.
Ah.
And it's for boys. Okay, Mancini, De La Salle is a co-ed school. The George Jackson is an all-boys school. And really trying to address the issue of the lost boy of color, particularly in a lot of the schools. Stuyvesant has got, you can count on one hand the number of African-American kids at Stuyvesant.
Yeah, 1%. 1%. How do you decide who, I mean, they have to apply. How do you decide who gets it?
We do a screening. A screening is an ability test. We use the Otis Lennon. It does if kids in the ballpark can handle a rigorous curriculum. Once we get through that teacher recommendations, we choose about 250 kids for what we call the simulated school day. We invite them back for a second round. And they're with other kids. Each of my teachers will see the kids for at least one period. One of the sessions is a large group session, English department teaching kids about haiku poetry. Classroom management, how do you do? Little test at the end of that little class. Second one, they're in a small group of 5. They're working together on a project together with the other kids, and they can't know each other. And the third one is when we invite them, we send them an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with outline and coat of arms. Who's your hero? What's your motto? Okay, what do you want to be? And your family. And then you have after 3 or 4 minutes to talk about yourself. So we go from large group to small group to you. And as soon as the kids leave, the faculty immediately get together and say, okay, all I want, positive, neutral, negative. Your sensitive child. And very often what always is wonderful is the kid who always gets negative is the highest IQ. Okay, which is always the faculty now knows, don't tell me. 135? Yeah, 135. Okay, and so part of it is that the brighter kid has developed a behavior pattern that is just almost antisocial. They've been out there on their own. So then what we do is we read the scores and decide to bring back about 150 or 60 back for a personal interview. And each of them are interviewed by 2 adults. And
so this is, what you just described does not even constitute the interview. An interview then follows.
Follows.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a group of
the torture begins.
No, and it's they're very often they're very, very supportive, and what we're looking for the kids who that really need the school, but they have the ability, and you can see the lights beginning to dim. That you know that these kids need an experience to really be turned back on again. So
You finish with 8th grade, don't you?
We finished in 8th grade.
Then where do they go?
We place them in. We need to find a place that's going to continue what they've done with us. So we have a wonderful system in New York. You got the independent day schools.
Yeah.
So terrific school. We got independent boarding schools, great parochial school system, specialized public school system. You got a lot more now with these Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech kind of schools. We're smaller, a little more community. And we actually track them through high school and provide supports for them even for college placement.
Into college placement?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they never leave us.
But it's small. How many kids total?
170, and we're packed into an old parochial school building. We're packed.
You're packed.
Yeah.
But that means the graduating class is 60?
That's about 60 kids, yeah.
So you're able at that, I mean, the scaling is a question, obviously,
Very good.
in any
Absolutely.
of these things. He's talking about how many roughly let's say 8th graders in the state of Maryland?
65,000.
65,000. Yeah. This is the challenge. Harold, you've been to his school, right? You've seen this in action. Reflect upon it.
It's wonderful. It's incredibly impressive. There are a lot of kids, my impression, a lot of kids who were one-offs in their local schools before then, and they didn't fit, and they never had real friends, and never other kids like them. And Brother Brian has collected them in one place, and there's this look of recognition, like, oh, they're like us. And they're quirky, and they go off in bizarre directions, and you have a conversation with them, you don't know where it's going to go. You know, you're on for the ride. And it's wonderful.
Middle school.
Middle school. Quirky, to put it politely. So, Brandon, you weren't expecting this question, but a decade or so ago, you went through a gifted program in school in Michigan. How did that operate? What was it like? What grades? Full-time? What was it?
Yeah, it was a full-time pullout. Started in 4th grade, went through 8th. You took one class in 9th grade. Once you got to high school, our schools are kindergarten through 5th, and then 6th through 8th, and then 9th through 12th. You took a state test in 3rd grade. If you passed that test with some score, you took 3 more tests. I've actually asked my mom, my former classmates, and a few other people what these tests were, and no one can actually remember what the 3 tests were. I think one was IQ, one was some kind of interview, and there was a third. If you passed those, you got into the program.
But this is when you were 8 years old. I mean, this is 3rd
It
grade.
was 3rd grade when I
Okay.
took these essentially
Okay.
4 tests.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you were essentially in a full-time pullout, which was in a given school in our school district. So there was, I think, 2 classes in each grade, 30 kids each. But the rest of the school was kids who weren't in this pullout program. So you saw them when you went out for lunch. You saw them in a couple electives like gym occasionally, things like that, especially when you got in 6th through 8th. But the teachers were specially trained. They essentially only had these gifted kids. The program was called Talented and Gifted, like TAG. Yeah, and I liked it a lot.
And how is it different from what they were studying in the rest of the school, as far as you know?
I think the curriculum went more in depth. It went quicker, so you covered more and you went deeper. Math was kind of automatically accelerated to an extent, and then a subset of the gifted kids could be even more accelerated. You took some tests in 6th or 7th grade, again a state test, and they separated kids in math based on that. But a big part of it for me, I think, was who my classmates were. You find this when I think you go to higher ed and you're in like a small, pull-out, like 30-person class based on a larger class. If the people in your class are very eager, very engaged, very bright, I think everyone actually is advantaged because of that.
Was there
So kind of peer effects, I guess I'm saying.
was there intense resentment in the rest of the school, or did they just think you all were a bunch of nerds, or what was the?
Yeah, I mean, things kind of changed throughout the 5 years.
Yeah.
At the beginning, there was a lot of animosity. We would have, like we would play each other in touch football, soccer, and there would occasionally be, some
Violence?
violence, especially among the boys, obviously. But I would say 3-4 years in, a lot of my current friends actually were in the kind of regular ed.
Regular school?
And we ended up, kind of forming a big group that was composed of both, kind of academic groups, and it turned
Okay.
out fine. But definitely at the beginning there was animosity.
So, Jack, do Maryland public schools have programs like that in them?
Yeah, extremely common model, TAG or GATE, Gifted
Okay.
and Talented
Yeah.
Education, across the country. And in Maryland, you'll find a wide variety, once again based on size. And when you look at the policy, it sounds very good. It says that it's a student who's accomplished beyond the level of all other students, and that we have to provide them other services. The gap, the distance is between the policy and potentially the identification, and then the identification and what the school or school system is willing to do or actually can do. And that's where we find so many students that slip through the cracks or just never identified at all, because, or we identify them in primary talent development programs across the state, but then very little's done beyond that. And it is a serious problem in terms of thinking about students who actually have an identifiable need, but we don't act on that need.
Some
Really.
states have a policy that requires, or at least on paper, identification of high ability
Maryland
students.
does have such a policy.
It does
The
have.
law, the regulation says you must identify them and you must serve them, but it's incredibly uneven, school to school, school system to school system. And that's true in the state, it's true across the nation.
So on that one, the identification, the obligation to identify and serve, you would have gotten a plus from the Jack Kent Cook.
Yeah,
on
they
that one.
identified that we did do that.
But when it comes to what then actually is done for these kids or with these kids,
Yeah, it's much less even, it's much less uniform. The way of identification, for example, a universal screening test of some sort makes sense. I find it humorous they had to do 4 of them to figure out that it's just not that precise.
yeah.
It's not. If we found the threshold, serving everyone over a threshold makes more sense.
So on the point about smart poor kids, as you look across Maryland to the best of your knowledge, are the kids who end up getting good programs smart rich kids? How equitably distributed are the services, I guess is what I'm asking.
If you live in a school system that has high per pupil allocation, that
Yeah.
ranges from $11,000 to $16,500.
Yeah.
So if you're in the lower end of that, that's a barrier. Or if you live in a part of a county school system where there's a more critical mass of poor children, you're going to have fewer gifted and talented services in those schools because the attention will be on remediation and bringing kids to proficiency.
Yeah.
You just are.
Harold, you ran the biggest school system in the country, and you follow it pretty closely. How's New York City faring? Why did Brother Brian even have to do what he did? Why isn't the biggest school system in the country doing a great job of this?
Good question. So let me say what they are doing.
Okay.
In the middle school, there's enrichment programs and you're able to skip grades. In the high schools, they're particularly strong because there are a whole variety of high schools, many of which, as you know, are exam schools. So there's the Stuyvesants, the Bronx Sciences, and the Music and Arts, and the Brooklyn Techs. And today, there's also the Bard Early College High School, and its progeny.
There's one of those in
There's
Baltimore.
one in
now,
Baltimore
isn't
that
there?
opened about 6 weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excited
And
about
that's a very powerful model because the kids come out of it with an associate's degree, which in some institutions, some four-year institutions, mean the kids start as juniors. And, you know, I went to the 10-year anniversary of Bard Early College High School, and, you know, there's this desultory introduction. Here's the chancellor who started us, and the kids in the front, you know, polite applause. And there's this wealth of applause from the back. Well, that's where the parents are sitting. You know, and they're saying, he's the guy who saved us 2 years of tuition money. And, you know, the reality is, because tuition is so high, when you're offered something like this, and particularly when kids are able both socially and academically to mature in this way and are given that opportunity, it's a wonderful thing. P.S. There are some states in this country where it's illegal to accelerate kids, where you can't start them early in kindergarten, where you can't give them, you know, the middle school kid who wants to have a high school course, the high school kid who wants to have a college course. It's actually illegal. And that's the other side of
Right.
the coin from what your state is doing, where at least there's recognition
Right.
and identification, and the hope is that each state will then develop a pathway, and maybe you do it differently. In Montana, it's all about online, and in Rhode Island, maybe it's the governor's school. But every state ought to have a pathway. That's just not the case, and we're very far from it.
Just back to New York for one more question on that, though. We already commented on the racial disparities in the exam schools. What isn't being done for high ability poor and minority kids earlier so that they can get into the exam schools?
You know, you need a pipeline, and you need to cultivate these kids, and it doesn't just happen miraculously, you know, by itself. Easiest example, I got, you know, you're goading me into this conversation, I know, but I had a conversation earlier this year with one of the very esteemed senators on the Hill, who was asking the question, you know, I said, you know, 1,100,000 children, and that always has an effect with a politician. They go, you're kidding. You know, 1,100,000? What would you do? And, you know, I said, are you serious? You're asking, yeah, what would you do? And I said, okay, I'll give you one example, one idea that would guaranteed raise reading scores 30%. End summer vacation.
Absolutely.
Where is it written in the Constitution that kids are entitled to 3 months of summer vacation, right? You stop learning anything new on the day of the state test. So that's sometime in early June or end of May.
Right.
So it's all of June, all of July, and all of August. And then it takes 3 more months to bring them back up to speed, to remind them what they've forgotten, to get them back to where they were in June. Okay, so that means for 6 months a year, we're not teaching anything new. Well, how about 3 weeks? How about disperse those days throughout the school year? Now, the pushback is the vacation lobby. You know, the people who,
Yes.
you're laughing, seriously,
No.
it's the people who,
The
right?
King's Dominion
Yeah, absolutely.
law.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yes.
So, you know, are there things you could do? You know, I believe first and foremost, it's the family that controls how the kid thinks and how the kid develops. You know, whoever that caregiver is, they have a responsibility. But sometimes they don't know what to do, and sometimes it's hard. And if you were to have these kids have more time on task, more time in the school, more time, you know, in after school and enrichment programs and weekend things, and things that would actually make them interested and excited, you can do this. It's not impossible. But as long as we have, you know, for 6 months a year, we're not teaching them anything new, it's like fighting with, you know, a hand tied behind your back. It's crazy.
So, Brother Brian, in your school, are you teaming up with parents, or are you, in effect, extricating kids from their environments, or some of both?
Some of both. A lot of parents are incredibly grateful, okay, that the opportunities available for their kids that probably wouldn't be. And I've had many say, you know, whatever you can do for them, Brother Brian, whatever you and the faculty can do for them, I can't. And they'll basically, please take my child and give them an opportunity that I don't have. I have found wonderful opportunity working with parents. I love my parents, and the parents love the opportunity the kids have got. So it's not an antagonistic relationship whatsoever. We end up really supporting families, trying to get services into families as well. So it's a holistic approach. I think what we try to do is to establish a community of culture, a culture of community. I think the book that Carter wrote about the certain schools create kids of character. What is it about those particular schools? And it is all about creating, establishing a community. Kids are known, people feel part of, they're invested in. I think that's what we do. It's not just an institution, it's a community. It's a living, vibrant community. They stay in touch with one another. Families support one another. It really is that old sense of neighborhood community, even though we come from all over the city of New York. We've established, the parents have established, is really a network of support and care.
But that brings me back inevitably to the scaling question. Do you have copiers, emulators, people who are doing what you're doing, or are you a kind of a candle in the darkness?
We have tons of people come in for visit, and in fact, I'm on the founding board of of a charter school up in the South Bronx, working with on the board of the Crystal Ray Network. And the idea is anybody who can come and see what we have. And they will say, well, you can do it, we can't. And I said, try it. Push the envelope. Push the envelope. Okay, and you always ask for forgiveness. Okay, always ask for forgiveness.
Yes.
I couldn't do that. Oh, that's not terrible. Just play the Humbelina, but try to make it work. Try to make it work.
Does the public system in New York City, I mean, Harold was aware of you, but is there any evidence that you see that the public schools are trying to do anything like this at anything like scale? I mean, we're talking about, again, if you just talked about the top 10% in New York City, you're over 100,000 kids. Okay. So we're a lot of kids involved.
Yeah, I think we've also structured the thing that the right of child has become a commodity. If I'm being assessed on the strength of my school, okay, on the fact that I have the right of children and they're progressing and they're keeping up the standard scores, and my salary, my career is based on that, come on, I mean, they're not going to let them go. We haven't really made it easy, okay, for those schools to let those kids go and have the opportunity.
There are principals who have tried to create community. And there are principals in every school system on
Absolutely.
Maryland
Yep.
who view their role as community leaders and who try and bring the parents in and make the schools a coherent whole. But I think it is true, it's very difficult. And it takes, superhuman talents. It's not everybody who can do this. And it's not a 9-to-5 job. Certainly not 9 to 3, and it's not 5 days a week.
Yeah.
It's much more. I mean, and in the same way that phenomenal teachers stand out, and we can all remember who that teacher was.
Yep.
And it's no different from the principals.
So, Brandon, one more that you weren't expecting. We're here in a think tank which does research. One of our recommendations in the book, which you could think of as a throwaway, is better data and better research. But say a word about why that's actually needed. As you started digging into what we could learn about this subject and numbers and research, what did you find?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that we don't know really what works, and we talked about this earlier. Out of all the things we talk about in the book, really the only service that's proven is acceleration. The problem with that is that it's kind of only meant for the top 2%, say, but we want more than 2% served. So first of all,
And acceleration is prohibited in some places, as Harold was saying earlier.
Sure.
Yes.
Or not possible.
Yeah, but then beyond that, you can't really find how many places serve kids. You can't really find how many gifted kids there are in a given state. There isn't broad, disaggregated data. There isn't anything. Which is why in the book we had to use essentially a proxy, right? High achieving kids, we essentially just took NAEP and then we took PISA and TIMSS, and we looked at what they consider high scorers, and that's essentially our gifted kids, which isn't perfect, right? But because there isn't anything out there, I mean, there wasn't really another option.
To put this even more starkly, the data in this realm are really, really missing. But there's an additional reason for it, which is the field of gifted education has great difficulty agreeing on anything.
Right.
Like, what does gifted mean? And how do you find them? And how do you know one when you see one? And all these other issues. So if you think about the policy dilemma, and this is Washington after all, we have to think about policy dilemmas. If you cannot define precisely the population you're concerned about, and you cannot count how many people are in it, and you cannot say how many of the people who are in it are getting what they need, then you don't have a very effective lobbying opportunity. If you can't answer those kind of rudimentary factual questions that every effective lobbying operation in town has its version of. So I think this is just as true at the state level. I mean, you don't have clear, I mean, you have this obligation for districts to identify.
Yes. And we ask them to report back to us in their master plan each October 15th.
Yeah?
But it's defined 24 different ways, and what's reported is 24 different sets of practices and ways of approaching it, and there's no way to determine the impact at all of that. So if we had a threshold, some threshold across a state or every state, and each state could be different as long as it's a legitimate threshold, and then we ask schools and school systems to report what they're doing for students above that threshold and how they know it has an impact, then you could suddenly begin to start having conversations with lobbyists, and you could begin to ask a school system when you have two 10,000 student school systems side by side, generally the same demographics, why one is serving 30% of their students and one is serving 3%, or why this school system has no minority students being served and this one has multiple minority students being served. And those sorts of disparities exist all the time in the data. You see them all the time, but we never seem to get to the conversation because of the unevenness.
In this
of all
realm,
of this.
you don't have really common metrics.
None.
None.
There are none that I know of.
Well, this is a problem.
Yeah.
But, anyway, well, I started by saying we wanted to get this topic on the agenda. We think that this is a country that ought to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We think that this is a problem of equity for kids, especially poor kids who have high ability. We think this is a matter of international competitiveness for the country, human capital challenge. We need more highly educated people, and we don't just want our highly educated people to come from the upper middle class or from the ranks of white and Asian persons. And besides all that, it's an upward mobility issue. We were talking about this earlier today. In a country that's now obsessed about mobility questions, for whom should it be easiest to rise from poverty to prosperity? It ought to be poor people who are smart, okay? They ought to be the easiest case for upward mobility, but only if their potential is cultivated and identified and developed and given a chance to actually rise. So I think this is a triple header issue for the country. And it's obvious that my colleagues up here agree with me. I don't know whether there's an important role here for the national government other than maybe better data out of the National Center for Education Statistics. Do you see another federal role here?
I think ESEA
Yeah.
should ask states to count, and states should do it anyway. Because in the school system where I was superintendent, we looked at moving every student to proficient, and then if a school had moved, or even if they hadn't moved most of their students to proficient out of the 25 schools we had, we looked at how many of you moved to advanced, which was a very flawed measure, but it still showed growth in the Maryland state test of moving ahead instead of just saying proficient is enough. And I think the federal government should go to what Dr. Levy said, which is we can't do year-round school for every single grade at once. But if we went to pre-K through 2, 12 months of the year right now, and then did our threshold assessment in 3rd grade, we would get different results. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Different results right now, and this country can do it. It has the wealth to do that right now, to go pre-K through 2nd grade year-round.
Year-round.
And parents would love it. They would love it. You wouldn't have a single parent complain. Or very few.
This is true. Just one on the age point. Brother Brian, you found you weren't starting young enough with boys, so you essentially created another school to reach down to, you said, 4th grade.
4th grade.
And do you feel like 4th grade is sufficient? Because he just recommended a heavy push on K through 2. What's are there kids lost by 4th grade who could otherwise benefit from this? Do you know, or do you know?
I would know. I would say the reason why it's 4th grade is the curriculum is closer to the middle school and the upper elementary curriculum.
Okay.
So there's a fit. You know,
Okay.
otherwise, you have a real dichotomy between the kids here and then the other kids moving up. So coming in, you can combine the faculty and you can do the curriculum can mix pretty well together. I think by 3rd or 4th grade, particularly for boys, you got to move. All the indications are there. You'll see the drop off in performance. You'll see the behavioral pieces. I think I think anybody in the business, okay, would say that it's going to be by fourth grade, some intervention.
Jack Kent Cook's youngest program starts with 7th graders, is that right? Do you think that's okay, or do you think you all ought to find a way to reach younger?
So the tension for us is we're trying to find the exceptional kid.
Yeah.
And if you go very early, you're not going to be very good at measuring or picking or doing it right.
Okay.
If you wait until there's a certain level of maturity, you've got a better shot. But that's not an argument for not providing those kids with special benefits. You know, the earlier the better. I teach a course from time to time at Teachers College at Columbia, and I start the course by saying the big issue in American education today is why do the black kids do so poorly, and why do the Asian kids do so well, and it's not genetics, right? And there's a pause, and I say, okay, so what is it? And they come around to, it's the parent, it's the caregiver, it takes a village. And I say, okay, if it's the social and emotional stuff, then why are we talking about charter schools and vouchers and high stakes testing? Why aren't we talking about that? Those things are fractional. And there's not a good answer. The earlier the better, the more intensive the better. You've got to bring the kid out of their shell, and you do it in community. You do it, you know, in any way you can. But if you don't do it, well, then you begin to undermine social mobility, which is where we are today, with social mobility much weaker than it's ever been in this country.
It's time to open this up and invite the rest of you into the conversation. You had a hand up with a data question, if I'm not mistaken. I recognize a few people in the room, but I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves and ask your question. Go ahead.
Sure. Mark Nadell. The data question was
And
your
you're from where?
percentages.
You're from where?
From Arlington.
Okay.
Not representing
This is
anybody.
Washington. Everyone's identity is shaped by their. Go ahead.
The quick data question meant with the percentages in the chart you were going through, were they divided by the number of students who took the test or the number of students in 12th grade or 8th grade or 4th grade? Because some of the criticisms I've seen have said, well, in the United States, there's a bigger domain of people who are taking the test, some of the countries, whatever. But I had one other question about the year-round. I believe Arizona has some year-round schools because I have relatives there. Does any country have that? Have we tested? Do we see data that shows year-round has been successful?
Most of Asia
Japan is 220, aren't
yeah.
they?
Most of Asia is year-round. They
Year-round.
take much of the month of August off, and then some of New Year's, Chinese New Year's, but they do 220 to 240 days typically.
And we're at 180.
I'm going to let you. The test data we use, which are NAEP and PISA mostly, are pretty good samples of they're both sample tests, and they're both pretty good samples of the age or grade level of the country. And none of these goes above age 15, well, 12th grade NAEP does. So it's pretty universal that everybody's in school. There's a pretty good statistical sample of the people in school or in the country, in the case of PISA, at age 15. So I'm not really worried about data reliability here. And I think the explanation that, well, U.S. test scores are low because we're universally educated and these other countries aren't, well, the countries on this list are. This isn't Kazakhstan that we're looking at. In fact, in the early days of the research for this project, I had a poignant moment when some young people who run the gifted education program in Kazakhstan came and asked to be included. I said, you know, we've got to have, said to myself, we have to have countries here that Americans will take seriously as places we ought to know about. And someday Kazakhstan will be on that list, but maybe not right today. You, ma'am. Mike is coming your way.
Thank you. My name is Jacqueline Merrill. I'm with the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And I have a question for Dr. Smith.
Yes.
Dr. Smith, I very much appreciated your comment that it varies not only from system to system, but school to school. I have two students in elementary school, or two children in elementary school in Montgomery County, who have been identified as high ability students. And because we've moved several times, we've sampled 5 schools, and that means 5 principals. And I would say there's been tremendous variety in the ways and degrees to which their needs have been met in those different schools. But my question now is a historical one. You said we haven't really focused on high ability students since the 1980s, and I'm interested in that as a flex point. Was it the people who were leading the school systems up to the 1980s had been, shaped by the experience of Sputnik, and so they were interested in high ability students, and then the 1980s, that was
What
what changed in the 80s?
It was a Nation at Risk report in 1983, when it essentially said if you imposed this school system on a nation, it would be considered an act of war. If you remember that that's a paraphrase. And I think what happened at that point is we began to look at standards and saying we need to move every child to this curricular level, this curricular standard. So they all need to be able to add fractions. They all need to be able to write a complete sentence or a paragraph. And that then began to put real intense focus on kind of the middle. And then as we measured and began to disaggregate the data, we said, oh my goodness, look at these disparities for different student populations and different groups of students who receive different services. And the service that was never counted or began to be disaggregated and considered in that progression from 83 until we are now are the students at the highest level of ability. And my wife and I have 5 children. The first 2 qualified for GATE in Richland, Washington. The third one moved to Japan, so we never knew what she would qualify for. And then we adopted 2 little boys from Bulgaria when they were 7 and 9. So they were English language learners. And the level of service personally that public school gave to my 2 adopted sons compared to my 2 oldest children who qualified at very high levels for gifted and talented programs was huge. So I've seen it both professionally and personally. It just is. It's just not an area that we focus on service. And it's nice that Dr. Finn's a member of the Maryland State Board of Education, but this is just something I feel passionate about that we're not doing.
I'm still reserving judgment about whether it's nice or not.
Well,
But thank you for that. But Harold and Brother Brian, you've both been at this for a little while, longer than Brandon anyway. Is there a point in time when we did this better, or has this been a long-lasting problem for the country? Were we better at this once upon a time or not, as far as you can tell?
Well, I could talk about back in those days. There was whatever you could do. Anybody did anything. Just dive in and take it and run with it. There was that kind of a mentality because nothing was there.
So you mean totally decentralized?
Yes, yeah. I see a lot more of this ideologies. I never saw the ideologies as strong and as passionate about what can and can't be done. And being in an independent school, I can pat my colleagues on the back and say, "Geez, you should be independent. There's a great you can do when you're independent. You can react. You can be reactive. You can put into place what you see needs to be put into place."
Yeah. Harold, was this better once upon a time, or never?
So, parse it a little. It's too bulky a question.
Okay.
Boston Latin was started in the 1600s.
Right.
Bronx Science under Mayor LaGuardia. Bard, when I was there under Giuliani. And some of the other specialized schools, the smaller ones that we started, that's recent. So on the one hand, there's a history here, and we're not writing afresh. On the other hand, the foundation is inviting a group of principals together from highly selective public high schools. There are only 218.
Out of 20,000 high schools in the country.
Yeah.
Are there any in Maryland, by the way, that would qualify for this designation of selective admission public high schools?
Yes.
Montgomery?
Yes. There are some in a couple of the systems.
In a couple of the systems.
But,
Okay.
but the game is, it's not only the high schools and having special high schools, but
The
in a
feeder
world of technology, you'd
Yeah.
think you'd be able to do this, with MOOCs and online courses and other challenging things using the technology, and we're not doing that.
Back to the audience. You.
Hi,
Mike?
My name is Teresa Jackson. I typically don't do this, but I am a resident of Prince George's County, and for the past 10 years, I ran the Talented and Gifted programs in the district. I now serve as the chair of the Maryland State Department of Education Gifted and Talented Advisory Council. I also teach gifted classes at Johns Hopkins, so I wear many hats.
Okay. You've identified yourself thoroughly.
Yes. I would like to see more about universal testing and equity. I know there's been several articles that have come out. Prince George's County in Maryland is a minority-majority district. When I love doing the master plan update to be able to show the growth of our, to be able to compare our African-American students in our gifted program compared to the general population. And if you look deeply, we're consistent and proportionate in many areas, still have some areas with our Hispanic students that we need to improve on. 42% of our gifted students are on free and reduced lunch. I mean, we're pretty diverse. And we do universal testing in first and third grade. Multiple entrance points. We use cognitive
Meaning
ability.
all kids in the district?
Yes,
Okay.
9,000 first graders take the OSAT, Otis Lennon, and then 9,000 in third grade take it again, along with Achievement Stanford, reading and math. So we've been doing that forever. Our policies go back to the 70s. But I'd like to see more literature supporting that. Other districts around the state of Maryland, I mean, we have districts that don't even do universal testing. And if they do universal testing, they might use achievement assessments, but it doesn't have a real high ceiling, or they might they might only use a cognitive ability assessment, or they might only use the Naglieri, which is a nonverbal. And so in the literature, when we're talking about universal testing and equity, that's what, those articles that came out, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the Atlantic Monthly, pushing those out to the community makes a big difference.
The Atlantic article references this recent paper by these two young economists, Laura Giuliano and somebody Card, National Bureau of Economic Research paper just a few months ago. They did a very careful study that demonstrated that a universal screening program produces a more diverse population of students in the gifted program, whatever you call it. As opposed to waiting for parent initiative or teacher identification. And since the diversity of the population in these programs is one of the issues that's on people's minds, I can't think of any good argument against some version of universal screening, though you just described how it can be trivialized.
And I do think you have to be careful if you use that and you set a bar. If you set the bar at the same height for everyone, you actually saw this in New York. There's a single gifted test.
Citywide
Yeah.
bar.
And and any kid can take it, I guess. In the district that serves the Upper West Side, 42% of kids who took it passed. In the South Bronx, it was like 3%, and in Bedford-Stuyvesant, it was something like 4 or 5. Right, so if you set that bar the same for everyone, then it's going to produce a very
skewed result.
Yeah.
So is that a bad thing to have a single bar? You think there ought to be gradients?
No, I don't think there should really be a single bar. Instead of setting a score bar, we talk about this in our book. If you instead took the same percentage from every school or every school district, right? And then, like, say you took 5% from every school, the 5% who scored highest, put them into a gifted program, and then allowed teachers or admin to choose another 5, then you would actually have a lot of smart kids in some eventual gifted program. It would be a much more diverse set. You would have a lot of kids with more potential who weren't really there yet.
The example in the book is that Texas takes into the university
8%.
the top 8%, but from each high school, not statewide.
So, so pause for a minute.
Yes.
Is that fair? Is that fair to the kid who goes to a very difficult school, very rigorous school who's, just beyond the 8%, not getting into the University of Texas, versus the kid who goes to an easy school, a not very rigorous school, and there are 8% who are going, and if he were in the other school, 8 invites gaming, right? Gaming the system. I'll transfer to the easy school, right?
It's
And people
unfair
do
in a
that.
in a different way. Let's put it that way.
Exactly.
You do it statewide, and you will end up with an upper middle class or white and Asian population like
And that
Stuyvesant
ain't-
High School.
And that ain't great either.
No.
Yeah.
So you go ahead.
What if you took
Yeah.
a threshold and you didn't set it so high that it was unreasonable?
Yeah.
Because we have to always remember the definition. Are we looking for the bell-shaped curve of IQs, or are we looking for students have potential to be really successful academic students? So if you set it not so high, and the kids who went over it, you took them, then you had a band of kids, and among that band, you went back and said, can you do this?
Yes.
Can you do these 3 things we're asking you to do? And then you ask the school people, go through, look at this list of kids from your 500 student elementary school, and if there's a student that you believe has tremendous potential, who didn't land in the band, who didn't exceed the threshold, go back and find that student and do more study. I think if we build it, they won't come. We have to go out and get them. So that's what I think. We have to get them and bring them in.
So the argument that you're making very articulately is multiple thresholds, multiple checks.
Yes.
And that's consistent with Gardner's multiple intelligences, and it makes a lot of sense. Administering it is a nightmare because you get variation all over the place and profound, in my view, profound difficulty in ensuring consistency and coherence. I had one quick vignette. I had a principal of one of the specialized high schools in New York City tell me, you're the first chancellor who hasn't tried to get a kid into this school, meaning without the exams, right? And I was stunned. I thought, you jackass.
Yes.
It was shocking to me. And I said, here's my advice. If anyone ever calls you and says that, pick up the phone and call the New York Times. Right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Because if you don't, it's going to get out and you'll lose your job. But it just said, it was emblematic to me how in these big bureaucracies, if you give too much discretion and with a multiple factor identifier, I think you have to give discretion.
But
Does it work?
I'm only talking about academic pursuits, not the arts, which I think is another place for discussion. Check out Orchid Kids in Baltimore City. Incredible approach to looking at every kid in terms of music. Incredible. But if you just look at academic pursuits, reading, writing, and mathematics, they're the foundation for everything else, then I think it's doable, and it's no more difficult, and I say this with huge respect, and my beloved youngest son, Peter, had a solid, thick individual education plan in school, IEP. It's no more difficult than doing it for students with disabilities, if you do it right. And you got to front load it for success and think it through. If you say gifted by Gardner, no, it'll never work. Everybody in the whole school will be in there if you think gifted by Gardner.
I agree with that part.
Can I add something?
For sure. All right. We're about to turn.
Okay, I'll give it up. But I was going to say, in my 10 years of overseeing global universal testing for all first and third graders and multiple criteria based on NAGC standards, we consistently identified anywhere from 10 to 14% of our population for services, and they were quite diverse. So it works, and I was in an office of 2. So for a district of 125,000 children, it's out there, but we were so busy doing the work that we were doing, we weren't out there saying, here, take a look at us. We have some things that probably needs to get put into the literature.
Let's keep in mind the countrywide, 13-14% of kids are now in special education.
Exactly.
And obviously, some of them are also gifted. They're
Well,
so-called, doubly
3%
exceptional.
of our students were twice exceptional, 12%
Okay.
were
Now
English
give up the
language.
mic.
I'm holding it.
Next. I know you, but you better introduce yourself. Give him a mic.
Hi, Richard Collenberg with the Century Foundation. So I just want to throw one more twist into this discussion you were just having. I worked with the Chicago Public Schools on their selective enrollment procedures, and they admitted half the students just based on the top scorers. That was the narrowly defined
Citywide?
merit.
Citywide
Yeah,
top
citywide.
scores? Okay.
These are they have several selective, they call them selective enrollment schools. They're like Stuyvesant, just in Chicago. The other half, though, in order to avoid, the 1% Hispanic or 2% Hispanic, 1% Black that you have at Stuyvesant, they said the other half would be admitted as the top test scores within 4 different socioeconomic tiers of residences. And that produced a significant amount of racial and ethnic diversity, nothing like proportional representation, but much more diverse than the New York schools. And it seems to have survived politically, that you were able to marry excellence and equity in that fashion. So I'm wondering what you all think of that type of approach.
So they took 4 geographies in the city?
So each census tract was rated by 5 socioeconomic factors.
Okay.
And then they rank ordered all the census tract and then divided those into 4. So essentially, it was, you needed a lower score to get in if you were from the most socioeconomically disadvantaged tier.
And has this been done long enough to know how the kids who are admitted from that way do compared to the kids who are admitted on the basis of the...
Yeah, it's been in effect since I think 2009.
Okay.
And so I don't know that we have a lot of information.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, I was talking with the administrators there. They said there's been no noticeable change in academic performance for students.
So what about that approach?
Have pre-K through 2nd grade year-round for all children, and you will capture more children in those demographic sets that you're talking about. I would be fine with it as long as it's carefully constructed and we really pay attention to how it is, because it's not that precise. You have an IQ of 131 or 122, it's not that precise. You just know there's a threshold you need for academic pursuit.
Harold, how do you feel about the geography bands?
My discomfort with that is there's an inherent unfairness, it seems to me, if you don't apply the same rules across the board. Having said that, I also recognize that there's no hard and fast single objective measure for who's advanced. If you believe, as I do, that giftedness is a lousy term, because it's not a status, but rather it changes over time. There are different flavors, different levels of development. Kids are gifted at different things, and they get ungifted later on. And
At around the age of 14.
This is the overarching proposition that you ought to address the needs of the high-performing kids who are from low income is unexceptional. Implementing it, I don't propose, delivered wisdom. My thought is you just need to have a pathway, and every school should have a pathway. And if some do it differently from others, you do it your way and you do it yours, and Chicago does it its way and New York's does it a third way, that's fine.
Hang on a sec, because Jack was describing a state where every district does it its own way, and it's actually not fine because it's so discrepant.
If they actually do it from school to school, that's one thing. The discrepancy is that there's so many schools and so many districts that don't do it at all.
All right.
That's the issue.
And that's why we need metrics.
All right.
We ought to be able to look at your model and see if it's happening. I'm all for it. If the metrics bear it out, and we don't have any.
Okay. Next. Go ahead. Front row. Mike is coming. Who are you?
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm unemployed. Please hire me. Yes, actually, I have a question. I'll try not to ramble, go on too much of a spiel. But my main concerns are tracking and that our general school system would just strive for exceptional mediocrity to begin with. Whereas if we had no bar at all for our standard school system and it was just to strive as high as you possibly could, then that would be more of what's going on in these Asian countries at the top of these test scores. And I'm worried about tracking in these test scores because I think you might have included Hungary. Yes, it was Hungary. Possibly Poland too. Well, you didn't include them, but you could have, because at one time on the PISA, they made exceptional gains when they got rid of their tracking or moved it up to a much higher age, showing that tracking is impeding these test scores. And I feel like you're talking about two separate things as well, one being a small percentage, maybe 10% by the numbers on page 2, of truly exceptional, meaning not ordinary students that need some accelerated path, versus the 30% of high achieving students in Asia, which is no real exception. It's just a large majority of
Okay, sharpen it.
students.
What do you
Yes.
want someone to respond to?
Well, I want you to respond to how is what you're proposing not tracking? How are we not just brain draining regular schools versus how do we identify what's an exception and what just needs to change over our standards at large?
They should answer. I myself am not opposed to intelligently constructed tracking systems. Let me be honest about that. Go ahead.
I mean, I think what you raise is a fair concern. What the foundation looks to is to find the tippy top. In other words, what we're looking for is the extraordinary person. But I take the point, there is a large number of people in that advanced category, and are you siphoning them off, and are you boxing them? I'm not thrilled about tracking, but I do think that those kids are entitled to more. They're entitled to enrichment. They're entitled to rigor, and you ought to give them that. And that may mean you leave them in regular classes for much of the day, and there's a pull-out or there's an extra on top. That, I think, is a way of dealing with both sides of that. I'm somebody who was tracked, okay? And because my parents put me into school after taking me to Germany, and I came in speaking German, I was in the slow class. And candidly, never got to the fast class because you'd only could be moved up one category every year. So I ran out of classes before I could get there. Is it crazy? Is it offensive? It's not great. But the alternative of ignoring those kids, that's worse, my view.
I should also add that the Asian countries that you're talking about, they very much do track. They almost all have very selective high schools, especially, that everyone tries really, really hard to get into. They try so hard that they go to kind of cram schools after school.
Yes. In fact,
so
I think that's where the majority of their learning would take place, in those independently private
But
student
that
sessions.
also brings in its own inequity, because who can afford to go to that? And the kids who can afford it get an extra edge on the competitive high schools, even though there's no official tracking in the public schools. Okay,
Gratefully, du bist hier jetzt.
give up the mic to the young man in the middle on the corridor.
My name is Jeremiah Gothrop. I'm a teacher in DCPS, and my question had to do with your chapter on differentiation, and because it seems like a lot of this conversation is focused on separate programs outside of the public school, and as a teacher, as a special educator, I'm curious what policies you would propose to help better prepare teachers who are trying to differentiate for kids inside the classroom.
Excellent question. We do have a chapter which says, they're part of a chapter that says differentiation sounds good on paper, but is bloody hard to do in the real world. And that it's not a satisfactory solution to the problems that we're here to talk about. But your specific question is how to help teachers get better at it if they're obligated to do it. Is that right?
it doesn't, differentiation is never going to work for the outlying students. If we're going to talk about the top 10% of students who already can do everything you've assigned in a regular 4th grade classroom, then you're going to have to give them something completely different to do. And it's not going to work for the student who has a significant learning disability or is an English language learner and is just acquiring a social language, let alone an academic language. I think differentiation can work for that middle band, that distribution of students in the middle between like 25 and 75 or however you want to think about it. And one of the ways we need to do is get rid of methods classes in teacher prep and stop doing professional development that's about activities and start talking to teachers about project-based learning, start talking to teachers about discussion-based learning, start talking to teachers about questioning techniques, all the things that we don't seem to spend a lot of time, and the use of technology as an intensive learning tool. Then you can, but you're never going to meet the kids we're talking about here, the really, truly academically capable kid who's well ahead of the whole class, or the student who needs significant help at the bottom end. And you'll just, I mean, if you have 3 of each of those kids out of 30, then what do you do? How do you do that in your 4th grade class?
He's asking you.
I'm saying you don't. It's not going to work. Differentiation can work in the middle where there's degrees of understanding and mastery. It cannot work on the outlying.
So, go ahead.
So this is advocating for every school to have its own program or some sort of tracking system for every student in the public school to be able to move into the specialized program?
Well, I think what Jack is saying is that at each end of the spectrum, kids who are struggling and kids who are very far ahead, you need different arrangements than a regular class. And you need him to call up his colleague Kaya Henderson and tell her that you are being asked to do something unrealistic.
And not even rigid ones. I don't even want rigid ones. I don't want to say you're going to go to a different school or in a different class all day, every day, 3rd through 8th grade. But some different treatment for those students on each of the, just like you're a special ed teacher. Your kids get a different treatment, some or all of each day. And we don't do that on the other end of the spectrum. A lot. We don't. Not enough anyway.
I think we can deal with one more before the bar reopens. Back in the corner. You are a colleague of Brother Brian.
I am, thank you, and thanks for Brother Brian, who found my son on Facebook and who reached out to me, and here I am. So, social media, very good.
And your name is?
My name's Nick Lazama. I'm a graduate of Monsignor Kelly, 1971, many years ago, and I'm the poor kid from the Bronx who was under an education. I'm not going to go on for too long. Just give me 3 minutes. I went to a school in the Bronx that I'm not going to name. It's not Kelly. And their educational theory was a Catholic school was if you didn't do so well, they would beat you with leather straps. And one day, I'm pretty methodical. I didn't do my work fast enough, and I got strapped. And I went to my mom, who's a Catholic school teacher in 2nd grade, said, "Mom, you got to get me out of here." So she found Brother Brian, and I went through the interview. So it was all very nice. And I said, "So you guys don't beat us with straps?" And he said, No. So, okay, I'm in. So, and
a low bar.
Yes.
What can I tell you?
I like these guys. So, just to wrap it up, I think Brother Brian was visionary. We all agree with the concept. And I applaud you with the book because it really is a policy question. I think there could be easily 100 schools in New York City similar to Brother Brian's. And whatever you guys can do to emulate that and to nationalize it would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. We'll all stick around for a little while, so buttonhole the panel and help me thank the panel. This has been great.